The past few months have been hell. Vivian, my wife, had been carrying on an affair with one of her coworkers. It seemed like everyone knew about it, but nobody had the guts to tell me. I wasn't any better. I just let it continue, somehow hoping it would magically end, and life would go back to the way it was before. That was a fantasy, of course. Things never go back to how they were. We'd been married for 19 years, 3 kids together. Bryce, our oldest, was 18 and in his senior year of high school. Vivian had been pregnant when we got married, and just a year later, Tessa came along. The next year, Paige was born, and that's when I got the vasectomy. They were good kids. We hadn't had any real issues with them until recently. And of course, the problems weren't their fault. They were a direct result of their mother's extracurricular activities. Vivian had been working in the claims department at a large insurance company for the past 3 years. Things started to shift when she began staying late a few nights a week, claiming overtime. The kids noticed. I noticed. Her appearance changed too. A new haircut, a gym membership, sexier underwear that, unfortunately, I never got to see. Tessa and Paige once saw her having lunch with her boss at some fancy restaurant. Vivian never even mentioned it. In my desperation, I started following her like some kind of obsessed fool. It wasn't hard to figure out where she was going, regular trips to cheap motels with her lover. It was so blatant, it almost felt like she wanted to be caught. I didn't really need evidence, but I still kept track of the dates and times of her rendezvous, as if that would change anything. As her affair dragged on, the family fell apart. It all happened in silence. The kids resented their mother for cheating. They were also angry with me for not confronting her. Meanwhile, I was trying to hold everything together, too stubborn to see that it was already lost. The only time we came together as a family was for dinner. Even then, it was a strained affair. No one spoke, and one by one, as they finished eating, the kids would slip away, usually out of the house until bedtime. One evening, Vivian finally brought up the tension. "Colin, I'm not going to put up with the kids' attitudes much longer. If you don't do something to straighten them out, I will." "I'll handle it," I said, though I had been saying that for weeks without doing anything. "You've been saying that for over a month now. What's gotten into them anyway? Why are they acting like spoiled brats all of a sudden? If you've got a solution, maybe you should try getting some answers while you're at it." "Oh, I've got it figured out," I replied, though the hard part was still figuring out how to fix it. "I've got it under control." "Care to let me in on it, or is this some big secret plan of yours?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "No secret," I said, taking a deep breath. "I'm moving back in with my parents tomorrow." Vivian froze. The plate she was holding clattered onto the table as she sat down with a hard thud. "What are you talking about, Colin? You can't commute from Ridgeville, and I can't handle this house and the kids by myself. How is that going to solve anything? You won't have to worry about taking care of the kids." I said, my voice calm. "They're coming with me." She glared at me, her brow furrowing and her lips tightening into a thin line. It was exactly the reaction I expected. Leaning forward, she locked eyes with me. "There's no way in hell you're taking my kids out of this house. What makes you think you can do something that stupid?" "They're the ones who made that decision," I answered quietly. Vivian let out a frustrated sigh, got up, and went back to clearing the table. She was muttering under her breath, but I couldn't make out any of the words. When she slammed the last dish into the sink, she whirled around to face me. "Why? Why is this happening?" I stood up and crossed my arms. "Because they're tired of being humiliated." "Humiliated?" She looked at me as though I'd just said something insane. "What the hell are you talking about?" "It's your affair with Brian White," I said flatly. "You've made it so obvious that the whole family knows. And you don't seem to care about any of us. Not me, not the kids." Vivian's face turned pale. "What? Are you seriously going to deny it? Are you actually going to stand there and tell me you're not spending several days a week at random motels with him? That I'm somehow confused about all of this?" I realized I didn't want to go down this road anymore. Sure, I could have thrown it all in her face right then and there, but I didn't have the stomach for it. Instead, I just pushed my chair back and left the room. Vivian remained by the sink, her hand resting on her hip, wearing that defiant expression like she was daring me to bring it up. It felt like she had been waiting for this, maybe even provoking it, just so she could unload her guilt and throw it back at me. I knew if I pushed, I'd get some rehearsed speech about how my failings as a husband drove her into someone else's arms. how I wasn't good enough. Sure, I could have thrown insults like slut and whore at her, but in the end, I'd still end up being blamed. I knew her too well for that. She had planned every word she would say. My best move now was not to engage at all. "What about your job?" she called after me. "I quit," I said flatly. She was screaming my name as I walked out the door, but I didn't look back. I had no idea where the kids were at that moment. All their clothes and belongings were packed into Bryce's Subaru Outback. The car had over 100,000 miles on it, but I figured it could last another 100 even. My stuff was crammed into the back of my Jeep. Clothes, personal papers, everything I needed. Vivian hadn't even noticed when she came home. We had all agreed that whatever we couldn't get on this first trip, we'd come back for later. I was certain that she'd be going through the house once she realized we were gone, but there was no turning back now. I decided to call Tessa. She was the one who always seemed to have things under control. Even though Bryce was the oldest, he didn't mind letting Tessa take the lead most of the time. "Tessa, it's Dad. Are you still at the house?" "No, I'm heading to a motel now. I told your mother what was happening, but not everything. I think it's best if you guys find somewhere to stay tonight. Can you get in touch with Bryce?" "No problem. Paige and I are going to crash at Betsy Cooper's. I'm not sure what Bryce's plans are, but I'll track him down." "Good. Meet me at the Waffle House on Cedarwood Avenue tomorrow morning at 6. We'll head to Ridgeville from there." "Dad, was Mom mad?" "Probably. I'll fill you in tomorrow. After you talk to Bryce, it's probably best if you turn your phone off." After checking into the Maplewood Inn, I turned off my own phone. I had just stepped out of the shower when there was a knock at the door. Bracing myself for a confrontation with Vivian, I opened it, only to find Bryce grinning back at me. In a small town like ours, there weren't many motels to choose from. By 7 the next morning, we were on the road, heading to the coal regions, back to my childhood home. Vivian and I never did get around to discussing my job. Not that it mattered now, I was unemployed. Normally, you'd try to sock away some cash before something like this, but at this point, I didn't care. Filing for divorce meant declaring assets and splitting everything up fairly, but honestly, screw that. I figured letting my credit tank wasn't the worst idea under the circumstances. Without a job, the kids would probably qualify for all kinds of grants and aid for college. I'd make sure they had what they needed, even if it wasn't all on the books. Living with Mom and Dad would help cover the rest of the expenses. I was pretty sure Vivian wouldn't wait long to serve me with divorce papers, and I wouldn't fight it. I'd probably go along with whatever she wanted just to get it over with. Not that there was much she could take. I didn't have a job, and the kids weren't going with her, even if the courts ordered it. All I could do now was wait. Life had handed me a basket of lemons, and it was time to start making lemonade. Returning to my hometown felt strangely comforting. The last time I'd lived there was just before heading off to college. After graduation, the best job I could find was in Reading, which worked out fine for Vivian since it was close enough to her hometown of Baltimore. We got married just before my final semester at Keystone State University. Vivian had dropped out when she got pregnant with Bryce and never seemed interested in going back. Looking back, I sometimes wondered if college was just her way of escaping her parents and finding a husband. For better or worse, she found me. I used to think I'd hit the marriage jackpot. 3 amazing kids and a wife who, well, turned out to be a nightmare. Regrets? Sure, but I wasn't the type to dwell on the past. Not that I expected my past to come rushing back so quickly. Living in town again had its advantages. Plenty of old friends were still around, which made finding under-the-table work relatively easy. Every penny I earned, I set aside, keeping it out of Vivian's reach. Until she officially filed for divorce, things were bound to be tight. The kids stepped up without me asking, pitching in like it was their responsibility. I hadn't left Vivian because of them. But it was clear they thought otherwise. My parents, bless them, accepted some financial help from me, though reluctantly. I knew they didn't want me to feel like I was freeloading, but honestly, we didn't need to contribute much. 2 weeks passed before Vivian called. "Are you going to make the mortgage payment this month?" she asked. "No," I replied simply. Another 2 weeks went by, and she called again, this time about her car insurance. My answer didn't change. Then came the inevitable. She brought up the affair. I could hear her trying to sound apologetic, like she genuinely regretted what she'd done. But her words felt hollow. She launched into a rambling explanation of how her friendship with White had spiraled into something physical. She insisted it was nothing more than that, just physical. Her voice faltered midway through as if even she realized how pathetic it sounded. I stayed silent. "I'm sorry, Colin," she said finally, her voice soft. "I don't have any excuses. I'm truly sorry." That was the last time she called. Eventually, Vivian seemed to accept the inevitable and filed for divorce. It wasn't long before she was left juggling the mortgage, car payments, and utility bills on her own. Legally, I was supposed to help with those expenses, but at this point, I wasn't interested in playing by the rules. If thousands of other deadbeat dads could avoid paying, so could I. Let my credit tank. I didn't care. When the divorce papers arrived, I signed them immediately, along with a power of attorney for her to sell the house. After closing costs and commissions, she wouldn't walk away with much, but that wasn't my problem. Meanwhile, Bryce was busy sorting out his college plans. We stuck to in-state options to keep tuition manageable. Some of the grants were tricky to secure since I had to provide last year's tax returns. But I explained my current situation and managed to get a few waivers. Bryce, however, had a more immediate concern. "Dad, I've got a bit of a situation," he said one afternoon. "Let me guess. You want me to fix it?" I replied. "Pretty much," he said with a grin. "I met this girl a few weeks ago, and I really like her." It wasn't what I expected, but it was a welcome change. Bryce had dated a few girls in high school, but none of those relationships seemed serious. Hearing him sound hopeful about this one felt like a good sign. "Let me guess. You don't need the birds and bees talk, right?" I joked. "No, Dad, I'm good there," he said, laughing. "The issue is her mom. I met her for the first time recently, and she completely flipped out when I introduced myself. Hope, her daughter, said she's never seen her act like that before. Her mom even told Hope she couldn't see me anymore. After some back and forth, she changed her mind, but only on one condition." "And what's that?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "She wants to meet you. Apparently we can date, but only if you talk to her first." "So, let me get this straight. This girl's mom will let you date her, but only if I have a chat with her first?" I said, surprised. "Exactly," Bryce confirmed. "Hope said her mom's never done anything like this before." "Well, I guess I can make time," I said, shaking my head. "You set it up and let me know when." Bryce's grin stretched ear to ear as he left the room, and I was left wondering why this woman needed my approval so badly. Later that evening, Bryce drove me to Hope's house. It was an older, narrow home, just off the main street, the kind of place that probably hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in a decade. The cracked and uneven sidewalk outside suggested repairs were long overdue. Hope opened the door eagerly as we approached, her smile genuine despite the awkward circumstances. "Hi, I'm Hope." She had a bright, bubbly energy about her that instantly explained why Bryce was so drawn to her. "Thank you so much for coming, Mr. Jackson. I'm really sorry about all this, but my mom insisted. I hope it's not too inconvenient." "Not at all," I said, offering her a reassuring smile. "I'm sure we'll work things out." "Mom, Mr. Jackson is here," Hope called toward the back of the house. When her mother walked into the room, my chest tightened as if all the air had been sucked out. Standing before me was Brooke Cooper, my high school and college sweetheart. "Hello, Colin," she said, her voice calm but tense. "Hi, Brooke," I managed to reply, the words automatic like my brain was on autopilot. The silence that followed was awkward, thick enough to cut with a knife, until Bryce finally spoke up. "Wait, you two know each other?" Brooke kept her gaze locked on me. "Your father and I went to school together," she said, her tone clipped. Hope visibly relaxed. "Well, that's good, right? That should make this easier." Brooke gave a small, forced smile before gesturing toward the kitchen. "I just brewed a fresh pot of coffee. Let's talk in the kitchen. It'll be more comfortable." I followed her through the narrow hallway, the weight of Bryce and Hope's curious stares lingering as we left them in the living room. "You two stay here," Brooke said firmly. "Turn on the TV and don't wander. I'll call you when we're done." Once in the kitchen, Brooke busied herself pouring coffee while I tried and failed to keep my thoughts from spiraling. Memories of our time together at Keystone State University came rushing back. The arguments, the mistakes, and how it had all fallen apart. It was just before Thanksgiving break in our final year when we had a fight. I didn't want to go home. She did. She left, and while she was gone, I made one bad decision after another, partying too hard, drinking too much, and getting arrested for disorderly conduct. Brooke came back furious, barely speaking to me. By Christmas, she had gone home again, still angry. That's when Vivian showed up in my life. She approached me at the student union, claiming we'd slept together during one of my drunken nights at the frat house, and that she was pregnant. With my relationship with my parents already strained, I panicked. Before I knew it, Vivian and I had driven to Gretna Green and gotten married. Brooke found out after New Year's and dropped out of college almost immediately. I hadn't seen or heard from her since, and now here she was, still stunning after all these years. "You're daydreaming," Brooke's voice broke through my thoughts. She placed a steaming mug of coffee in front of me and sat down across the table. "Sorry," I said, trying to gather myself. "I wasn't prepared for this. You'll have to give me a moment to catch up." Brooke was still easy to talk to, though her expression remained guarded. I suddenly realized I didn't even know her last name now. Bryce hadn't mentioned Hope's either, and so I hadn't put the pieces together. Trying to lighten the mood, I said, "So, is there a Mr. Brooke in the picture, or is it just us talking today?" She didn't smile at the joke. Instead, she leaned forward, her voice firm. "That's what I need to talk to you about, Colin. I'm not looking for anything, but we need to address a major problem." "A problem?" I asked, confused. She hesitated before sighing. "I never got married. I tried dating a few guys, but none of them stuck around. Most weren't interested in a single mom, and the ones who were, well, they weren't looking for anything serious." "Single mom?" I repeated, the realization creeping in like a slow storm. She gritted her teeth, frustration evident. "Colin, you're Hope's father." My breath caught. "What?" "I wanted to tell you in a better way, but sometimes life doesn't cooperate." I blinked, stunned. "Can I get some more coffee?" "That's it?" she asked, incredulous. "That's all you have to say?" Taking a deep breath, I set the mug down. "I guess that explains why you didn't want them seeing each other." Brooke's expression darkened. "Unfortunately, I realized who you were too late. By the time it clicked, Bryce and Hope had already grown close." I buried my face in my hands. "You're saying there's a chance they might be related?" She nodded solemnly. "It's a possibility I couldn't rule out." I let out a strained, bitter laugh, shaking my head. This is the kind of situation you'd think only happens in bad soap operas. The coffee was scorching, too hot to drink. I blew on it, watching the steam swirl away as Brooke, my daughter's mother, sat across from me, her eyes fixed on mine, waiting for some kind of guidance I didn't have. "Brooke," I said finally, my voice low, "we don't have much of a choice. We have to tell them. We just have to hope it's not too late." Her expression softened, guilt flickering across her face. "I'm sorry, Colin. I should have told you years ago, but I couldn't. You'd just gotten married, and I didn't want to ruin things for you." I raised an eyebrow. "So instead, you decided to carry the weight of this all by yourself?" She let out a heavy sigh. "I didn't ruin my life, Colin. I have a wonderful, smart daughter. Sure, things didn't go the way I planned, but that doesn't mean my life was ruined." I leaned back in the chair, finishing my coffee in one long sip. It felt like my brain was working overtime, but I couldn't afford to lose my composure. "By the way," Brooke said hesitantly, "I don't mean to pry, but where's Vivian?" "We're estranged," I replied. The word felt strange and unfamiliar in my mouth, but it was the best I could manage. "Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to..." She trailed off, leaving the air between us awkwardly silent. We sat like that for a while, neither of us knowing how to fill the space. Finally, Brooke broke the quiet. "Colin, do you want to tell them, or should I?" "You go ahead," I said, nodding. "I'll be here to back you up." It took less than a minute for Hope and Bryce to join us at the kitchen table. Brooke placed a folded piece of paper in front of Hope. Her hand trembled slightly as she slid it across the worn formica. Hope's eyes widened before she even touched the paper. "Oh my God," she whispered, instantly grabbing Bryce's attention. "What is it?" Bryce asked, his face scrunching in confusion. It's that birth certificate," Hope said, her voice quivering. "The one I wasn't supposed to see until I turned 21. "What's so special about a birth certificate?" Bryce asked, leaning closer. But Hope ignored him. Her fingers unfolded the paper with shaky urgency. As she read it, her face drained of color, her expression shifting from disbelief to horror. "No," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "No, this can't be right. There has to be some mistake. Mom, tell me this isn't true." Brooke kept her gaze fixed on the floor, her silence louder than any explanation she could have given. "Mom," Hope cried, desperation rising in her voice. "Please, tell me this isn't true." When Brooke didn't respond, Hope flung the birth certificate across the table. It fluttered to the floor as she bolted from the room, her sobs echoing down the hallway. Dad, Bryce said, his voice thick with frustration and confusion. What the hell is going on? I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I'm sorry, Bryce, this was never going to be easy to explain, but you needed to know. Know what? He demanded, his voice rising. Just tell me. I looked him in the eye, my voice quiet but firm. Hope is your sister. The room fell into a suffocating silence. In the distance, we could hear Hope's muffled sobs. Bryce stood slowly, his face blank with shock as he tried to process what I'd just said. Without a word, he turned and walked out, leaving the kitchen and heading toward the sound of Hope's crying. The house grew quieter, Hope's sobs fading as Bryce reached her. I let out a long sigh, rubbing my temples. Turning to Brooke, I gave her a weary look. You wouldn't happen to have a beer, would you? Brooke and I were finishing our second beer when Bryce appeared in the doorway. His shoulders were slouched, and his voice was quiet. Can we go home now, Dad? I nodded, setting the bottle down. Yeah, let's go. 2 days passed before Bryce spoke to me again. The atmosphere in the house had been heavy and silent, so I was relieved when he finally broke it. I want DNA tests, he said firmly. I've got the money for it, and I'm not taking no for an answer. All right, I replied, caught off guard. Where do we even get that done? There's a lab in Allentown, Bryce said. It's $200 per test. I want to test Hope, you, and me. I nodded thoughtfully. If we're doing this, we might as well test Tessa and Paige too. I'll cover the costs for everyone. Do we have to go there, or can they send the kits by mail? Either way, Bryce answered, but I'd rather go in person. Fine by me, I agreed. Set it up and we'll make a day of it. Dinner at Olive Garden is on me. That afternoon, I decided to make a call. Guardian Fire and Water Protection, the insurance company where Vivian and Zane White worked, wasn't hard to reach. I got through to the head of the legal department. He made it clear he wasn't interested in my personal issues, but when I casually mentioned White's workplace affair with Vivian and asked about their company policy on such matters, his tone shifted. The call ended abruptly after that. A few days later, Vivian called me, her voice frantic. She'd lost her job and was struggling to make ends meet. When I told her I was still unemployed and staying with my parents, she sounded even more desperate. She begged for enough money to move back to Baltimore, where she hoped to start over. The house wasn't selling, her bills were piling up, and her car was on the verge of being repossessed. She tried to justify her affair with White again, but I didn't respond. What she didn't know, and I didn't tell her, was that Zane White had also been laid off. She never figured out how or why. 2 days later, I walked into the house to find Bryce and Hope sitting on the couch, grinning like they'd just won the lottery. What's with the smiles? I asked, grabbing a cold Foster's from the fridge. Do you want the good news or the good news? Hope teased. Isn't that backward? I replied, smirking. Bryce shook his head, laughing. Nope, some of it might seem bad, but overall, it's good. All right, quit messing with me, I said, half laughing, half exasperated. Bryce sat up straighter, his expression serious, but still warm. Tessa and Paige are both your daughters. The DNA confirms it. A wave of relief washed over me. Well, that's a load off. Do they know yet? Hope shook her head. Not yet. We wanted to tell you first. I leaned against the counter, narrowing my eyes. Okay, what aren't you telling me? Bryce hesitated on glancing at Hope before meeting my gaze. Hope is your daughter. The DNA is a near-perfect match. I blinked, trying to process the news. All right, so where's the part where the second good news comes in? Bryce's smile faded and his voice dropped. Don't freak out, Dad, but I'm not your son. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at him, stunned. I'd raised him, loved him, and now this. I shook my head, muttering, I'm going to need another beer. Grabbing another from the fridge, I sat back down. The lighthearted mood from earlier had evaporated, replaced by something heavier. Bryce leaned forward, his voice steady and sincere. Dad, this doesn't change anything. You're still my father, no matter what the DNA says. I don't know who my biological father is, but you'll always be my dad. I exhaled deeply, nodding as I fought back the swirl of emotions. I appreciate that, Bryce, more than you know. The room fell silent again, but this time it felt less tense. There was still so much to process, but for now we had a little clarity, and that was enough to start with. I was halfway through the new beer when I finally broke the silence. I don't even know how to feel. Should I be happy or sad? Is this good news or bad news? I honestly don't know what to do. Hope and Bryce stayed quiet, their expressions sympathetic but offering no answers. "Hope," I asked after a pause, "have you told your mother yet?" She shook her head. "No, not yet." "Well," I said, taking a deep breath, "why don't you and Bryce go over and tell her? I've got a lot to think about right now." Mom and Dad, who had been quietly keeping to themselves in the kitchen, stayed out of the way, as they often did during moments like this. "Colin," Dad said gently, stepping into the doorway, "if you need anything, let us know. We're not going to give advice unless you ask, but we're here for you." That was Dad, always supportive, always steady. I wanted to be the same for Bryce, but in that moment, I didn't know how. Later that evening, Brooks somehow found me at the Silver Oak Tavern. I had no idea how she knew I was there, and I wasn't entirely sure when I'd gotten drunk. It had been years, over a decade, since I'd let myself overindulge like that. Things weren't terrible, just overwhelming. Looking back, I don't know why I let myself sink into that state. The next morning, I woke up groggy and disoriented on Brooks' couch. To my shame, I realized I'd wet myself during the night. Embarrassment washed over me as I sat up, still fully dressed but missing my shoes. The smell of fresh coffee wafted in from the kitchen, but before anything else, I needed to find the bathroom. After cleaning myself up and climbing down the stairs in my sorry state, I shuffled into the kitchen. Brooke sat at the table waiting, her expression calm but unreadable. "Morning," she said, pushing a cup of coffee toward me. She didn't offer any food, but honestly, coffee was all I could handle. "I really messed things up, didn't I?" I muttered, cradling the mug in my hands. I don't even know where to start with apologies. Brooke studied me for a moment before speaking. "Seems like you weren't the only one who slept with Vivian that weekend. You just happened to draw the short straw." I let out a bitter laugh. The thing is, I don't even remember sleeping with her. I just assumed it happened because of how she came to me with the news. I didn't have an alibi or anything to prove otherwise, so I took the easy way out, like a coward. What a sucker, huh? Brooke's tone was dry, her words cutting just enough. "I'm not going to argue with you there." I sighed, leaning back in the chair. I have no idea what to do next. "I thought the divorce was already in motion," she said, raising an eyebrow. "It is," I replied, "but it feels like there's something else I should be doing." Brooke shrugged, her tone matter-of-fact. "Maybe start with a shower and a shave." She wasn't wrong. I looked as bad as I felt. "Think you could give me a ride home?" The next few days were brighter, at least for Bryce. He seemed in good spirits, and the girls had come to terms with the genetic revelations, though their feelings toward Vivian remained complicated. Mom and Dad stayed supportive, maintaining a careful balance between being involved and giving us space, which I appreciated. It was Bryce who decided it was time for action. "Dad," he said one afternoon, "I want to make lemonade." I frowned, puzzled. "What are you talking about?" "You know, like you always say, when the world gives you lemons, make lemonade." I nodded slowly. "Yeah, I remember." "Well, we've got a lot of lemons, so let's get started." I couldn't help but smile. How proud can a father be? But Bryce wasn't finished. His expression grew serious. "Mom has to know, Dad," he said firmly. "She must know who my real father is. It happened at the frat house, right? So it has to be one of your fraternity brothers. Isn't there some way to get her to give you some names?" I leaned back, considering his words. Bryce was right. There had to be answers somewhere. The question was whether Vivian would be willing to provide them. "Wow," I said, raising an eyebrow. "You're assuming there was more than one guy? That's a bold guess. Sounds like you don't think too highly of your mother." Bryce didn't flinch. "Not after what she did to you back then and what she's still doing now. She was a sleaze, Dad, and she's still a sleaze. How did you stay with her all these years?" I let the question hang in the air, choosing not to answer. Instead, I said, "I've got an idea. It might not work, but it's worth trying." That afternoon, I picked up the phone and dialed Vivian's number. I'd spent most of the day rehearsing what I wanted to say, but I still wasn't confident. There was a good chance I'd get flustered and mess it up. "Colin?" she answered, her voice laced with surprise. "What's this about? I wasn't expecting a call." Her tone raised a red flag. I had to tread carefully to avoid giving her the impression this was some kind of reconciliation attempt. "I've been thinking about our last conversation," I began cautiously. "You mentioned wanting to move in with your sister. Is that still on the table? Yeah, she replied warily. Why? Did you figure out a way to help me out? If so, I'd be really grateful. I can give you $2,000 to get started, I said, but I need something from you in return. There was a pause, longer than I expected, before she finally said, Okay, that would help. What do you need? I assume you don't know I had DNA tests done on all the kids, I said, letting the words hang in the air. Her gasp was audible. Oh no, she muttered, caught off guard. I was really hoping this wouldn't come up. Things seemed so good between you and Bryce. It struck me that she only mentioned Bryce, avoiding any reference to Paige or Tessa. And what about the girls? I asked, pointedly. What about them? She replied, her tone steady but confused. Their DNA results didn't concern you? No, she said, sounding genuinely perplexed. Why would they? Her response seemed sincere, so I let the topic drop. All right, I said, steering the conversation back. Here's what I need, the name, or names, of who Bryce's father might be. You give me that, and the money is yours. The silence on her end stretched far longer than I anticipated. Vivian, I pressed, my voice calm but firm. Whoever this guy is, he didn't stick around. He used you and left me to clean up the mess. I deserve answers, not him. She let out a long sigh before speaking. Fine. There were 3 of them. I don't know which one is Bryce's father. 3? I repeated, the frustration clear in my voice. I'm going to need their names. John Ward, Finn Sorensen, and Philip Anderson, she admitted reluctantly. I recognized the names immediately, 3 entitled spoiled fraternity brothers, who always acted like the rules didn't apply to them. They'd been loyal to each other, but cared little for anyone else. Thanks, Vivian, I said, keeping my tone neutral. I appreciate your honesty. What else did you say you needed, Colin? She asked, her tone noticeably lighter now. If you're not staying in the house and can't sell it, I'd like to take it, I said. Oh, absolutely, she said quickly, almost sounding relieved. I can't sell it, and I'd love for you to take it. Even if I found a buyer, I wouldn't make much after commissions. You can have it as soon as I move out. I'll sign whatever papers you need. There was a brief pause before she added, Colin, I do have one small favor to ask. What's that? Can you arrange for the kids and me to get together? Nothing formal, I just want to see them occasionally. I'm still their mother. I'll see what I can do, I said carefully, though I wasn't sure how the kids would feel about it. 2 days later, Vivian had her $2,000, and I held the title to the house, along with the mortgage. Bryce wasted no time digging into the background of the potential biological fathers. The DNA process was trickier, but he approached it with the same determination as everything else. Finn Sorensen, one of the contenders, was now a high school teacher in Altoona. As a state employee, his DNA was on file, though not publicly accessible. Somehow, Bryce managed to obtain what he needed, and the results confirmed that Finn wasn't his father. Philip Anderson, another candidate, was a less savory character. He was serving time in Ohio for crimes involving underage girls. While I tried not to pass judgment, it was a relief to know his DNA was easily accessible through the system. Once again, Bryce got the results, and as expected, Philip wasn't his father either. That left John Ward. If Vivian had been honest, he had to be the one. The search shifted into a higher gear. At this point, Simon Young entered the picture. Simon, an old high school friend, wasn't exactly a model attorney. He'd earned his law degree at Dickerson long after I'd gone to Keystone State University, and his less-than-ethical reputation made him perfect for this task. Using fraternity web pages and alumni networks, Simon helped track down Lieutenant Colonel John Ward, stationed at Eagle River Air Station in Maryland. John, who had been deeply involved in ROTC during college, had clearly stayed the course. With a little help from Brooks' cousin, who served in the Pennsylvania National Guard, we managed to secure John's DNA. The results came back quickly. John Ward was Bryce's biological father. By the end of the week, Vivian had moved out of the house. Instead of wrestling with the overdue mortgage, I refinanced the property, removing her name entirely. I moved back in, though the kids decided to stay in Ridgeville until the school year ended. Bryce especially seemed eager to stay close to Hope. As for me, I found myself wanting to be near Brooke, though there were still loose ends to tie up. Vivian's lawyer had done a lackluster job during the divorce proceedings. He hadn't even discovered that I hadn't quit my job. I'd only taken a leave of absence. It was as if he downloaded some cookie-cutter divorce form off the internet. With a few months left until the divorce was finalized, I wasn't expecting much resistance. Returning to work had a downside, though. It affected Bryce's college grants. The upside was that I could now afford to help with his tuition or secure a loan if necessary. Meanwhile, Brooke continued her steady 9-to-5 job in medical billing, managing paperwork for various doctors' offices. I started spending weekends in Ridgeville, where Bryce and Hope were thriving. The only minor issue was Hope spending a lot of time with Paige and Tessa, usually shopping. It left Bryce feeling slightly territorial, though Brooke and I found the situation amusing and harmless. Despite our increasing closeness, Brooke and I kept our relationship firmly in the realm of friendship. Neither of us seemed willing to make the first move towards something more intimate. It was as if an unspoken agreement kept things where they were. Meanwhile, Simon went to work flooding the legal system with paperwork. His strategy involved filing multiple lawsuits against John Ward, hoping that at least one would stick. His ultimate goal was to secure a partial admission of guilt that could lead to garnishing John's military pay. Simon worked on contingency, taking his fee only if a settlement was reached, which suited me just fine. I wasn't looking for financial gain. All I really wanted was help covering Bryce's college expenses, which would make things easier when Paige and Tessa eventually started their higher education. Bryce and I remained as close as ever. The DNA results hadn't changed anything between us. He was simply relieved to know Hope wasn't his sister, while I was grateful to have her as my daughter. Still, I couldn't help but feel a pang of regret for the years I hadn't been part of her life. She had gotten the short end of the stick, though she never seemed to hold it against me. Life gradually settled into a new rhythm. I had squared away the house's finances, though living there alone wasn't particularly enjoyable. Bryce and Hope had graduated and started jobs. Bryce was preparing to head to state college in 2 months, while Hope enrolled in a 2-year medical administration program at the Mid-State Career and Learning Center. Vivian called from Baltimore, her voice more defeated than I'd ever heard. Things weren't going well with her parents, and she remained stuck living with her sister, unable to afford her own place. Finding work was a struggle due to poor references from her previous employer. She expressed regret, saying she wished she could undo everything. While forgiveness wasn't something I could offer, I did tell her the girls were planning a trip to Baltimore to visit her. That seemed to lift her spirits, and the call ended on a brighter note, for her at least. As summer drew to a close, my life started to take a turn for the better. The divorce was finalized, and I was free from any lingering obligations. John Ward, after consulting his lawyer, officially admitted to being Bryce's biological father. Instead of a financial settlement, he agreed to cover all of Bryce's college expenses for 4 years and pay Simon's legal fees. Things quickly spiraled downhill for John, however, when his wife filed for divorce. She claimed nearly half of his upcoming retirement and discovered Bryce had been conceived just weeks before their wedding. Combined with John's other indiscretions, this revelation was the final straw for their marriage. The biggest surprise, however, came when Brooke appeared at my house one evening. It was too late for dinner, but just the right time to open a bottle of wine. We settled into the living room, and she wasted no time getting to the point. "Colin, I need a favor," she said, her tone direct. Her request caught me off guard, but after everything Brooke had done for me, I felt like I owed her. I was ready to help with whatever she needed. "Hope's starting classes at MCLC soon," Brooke explained, "and I'm worried about her commuting, especially in the winter with the mountains. Would it be okay if she stayed here with you?" Without hesitation, I agreed. "Of course. The girls are moving back in, so I'm sure they'll all get along." But something in Brooke's expression gave me pause. There was a mix of exasperation and amusement on her face, as though my response hadn't quite hit the mark. "I'm sorry, Brooke," I said, catching myself. "It seems like I missed something here. Help me out?" She sighed, shaking her head but smiling. "Colin Jackson, you are the densest man I know. I'm not letting you off the hook this time. I'll sit here until you figure it out. Now, pour me another glass of wine." It only took me a few seconds to catch on. By the time I refilled her glass, a grin had spread across my face. Everything fell into place as it should. Bryce thrived at Keystone State University, coming home whenever he could. Hope excelled at MCLC, and was on track to graduate a semester early. Tessa earned a scholarship to Jefferson Hills University, while Paige was still weighing her college options. As for Brooke, now Mrs. Jackson, she had built a thriving medical billing practice that served 3 counties. She hoped Hope would take over the business when the baby arrived. These days, we drink plenty of lemonade. As that famous English author once said, life goes on,